Okay. So this morning we're delighted to have Ben Slivka with us for a conversation about entrepreneurship. Ben and his wife Lisa are angel investors and advisors. They've invested in 19 companies since 2003, and they have 14 current investments in biotechnology, hardware, software, and space launch startups. Ben stepped down from the Northwestern University Board of Trustees in 2018 after 20 years of service. Ben and Lisa became philanthropists in 1997, using some of Ben's Microsoft stock options to create the Wisner-Slivka Foundation. He joined 800-person Microsoft in 1985 and helped it grow to over 30,000 people by the time he left in 1999. He interviewed over 500 people, hired 120 people, worked on OS/2, MS-DOS 6.0 and 6.2, Windows 95, and more. So we've got kind of a part of internet history here with us. So Ben, you've worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs and invested in 19 tech startups. After your time in Microsoft, you're helping find the next new big founders. Can you tell us a few stories about the entrepreneurs that you've met and the firms that they're building?
Sure, that'd be great. Well, thanks, Scott and TPI for having me here. It's been a fascinating experience for me because I'm not a policy guy. This is my first time here, so I took, I think, 55 pages of notes and trying to digest them. The United States is the land of freedom and opportunity. Immigrants come here for those opportunities. If you look at Silicon Valley startups, something like half of Silicon Valley startups are co-founded by an immigrant. If you look at software engineers and computer hardware engineers in the United States today, these are recent numbers, 39% of them are immigrants, right? And 17% of the workforce are immigrants. And so immigrants have had a massive impact on the United States. My father's parents left Ukraine, coincidentally. In 1904, they were Jewish and the Tsar's troops were killing the Jews. They got out of Dodge. My grandfather was a tailor and then a vegetable peddler outside of Chicago. My father was a musician, and now I'm a software engineer who retired at age 40. So that's the American immigrant story. The startups I'm working with make me very optimistic. You know, when we think about the things we've been talking about yesterday and today, we look at the war in Ukraine, we look at all this impending legislation, you could get a little bummed out if you think about how the Democrats and the Republicans both want to beat up on the big technology companies. Jamil said I think, a very important thing, which is we've got these incredible companies in the United States. And how many people use Russian software today? No hands. Japanese software? Nope, no hands. Chinese software? Well, your kids use TikTok, which might be a brainwashing activity of the Chinese Communist Party. We don't really know. And so if you look at the history of innovation, from the telegraph to the telephone to the airplane to the transistor and the integrated circuit and the internet, the United States leads the world in innovation. And we lead the world in innovation because we're the land of freedom and opportunity, right? And so what's fascinating to me is the enthusiasm apparently in Washington, D.C. to attack the tech champions of the United States. And as we've heard, the previous session, those companies are doing amazing work around the world, right? On my title, I put retired monopolists. Did anyone notice that, retired monopolist? Okay, so let me explain that comment. So I joined IBM in June of 1982, right out of undergraduate school. I went to Northwestern, and the DOJ had just abandoned a 13-year lawsuit for antitrust against IBM 5 months earlier. And that lawsuit had produced 30 million pages of documents. So then at Microsoft, it was an 800-person privately held company when I started, over 30,000 people when I left. Internet Explorer is my fault. I started that team in October 1994, grabbed 7 people. We built IE1, we built IE2, we built IE3. That was 22 months. I grew the team to 67 people. Val Harriet made a very good point about talent. Talent is super important in all of these kinds of things. And Internet Explorer 1 was included in Windows 95. How many people remember the Windows 95 launch and Start Me Up? Yeah, some of you guys remember that. It had no market share. And then we launched Windows IE2. We shipped it 4 months later in November 1995. It also had no market share. And then we launched Internet Explorer 3 in August 1996. It was the first implementation of cascading style sheets. It won all the reviews, and our market share went from essentially 0 to about 30% in 1 year. The IE4 team, which I was not part of, added dynamic HTML, and that's an important feature still today in web applications, and the browser share continued to rise. None of that had anything to do with being part of Windows. It had to do with being the world's best web browser. So if I'd done a shitty job of Internet Explorer 3, and we had no market share, and IE4 was shitty, the DOJ would had to find some other pretext to sue Microsoft for antitrust, right? So you can think about that. Okay, back to innovation and back to startups. So let me tell you briefly about 4 of the 14 startups I'm currently invested in. One of them is called Stoke Space Technologies. The 2 founders had been at Blue Origin for 9 and 7 years. Their goal is to reduce the cost of launching satellites to space orbit by a factor of 20. That would be a pretty nice improvement. They're doing that by focusing on high reusability. So that's one of my portfolio companies. They just raised a $65 million Series A round last fall. I'll pick one of the biotechnologies, Twin Strand Bioscience. They reduced the error rate of gene sequencing to 1 in 10 million base pairs. And typically that error rate's 1 in 100. One of the technologies that, one of the solutions they might be able to develop would be an annual test to screen for hundreds of different kinds of cancers. And that high accuracy would allow that to happen. So one of the hardware companies is a forklift tracking company. How many people have ever driven a forklift? Okay, all right, a few people have, right? I did that for a summer job in 1979. How many people have been in a 1 million square foot warehouse watching 120 forklifts whiz around? Anybody seen that? Okay. Well, forklifts are heavy powered machines. They kill people, the drivers do. They damage inventory, they damage the warehouse, they damage trucks, they put pallets in the wrong place. And so this solution is pretty clever. It's an immigrant. Oh, yes, here we go again. Mark Giangosi grew up in Austria, went to Northwestern for a computer science degree, and I met him when he was 20. He's about 26 now. So he mounts a smartphone on the underside of the safety cage of the forklift and monitors the behavior. It's got a down camera, up camera. And so he saved his largest customer over $1 million by their own metrics and reduced the safety incidents by 75%. And that was a span of 14 months, 6 warehouses, about 300 forklifts. He monitored 1.7 million hours of forklift operation. And when the forklift jiggles, when the 9-axis sensor in the smartphone detects something, he processes the images and sends a message, an email message to the human managers of the warehouse, circling in red, look right here on the video, this is where something happened, which gives the human managers an opportunity to go back and work with the forklift drivers. And I'll pick one, well, my final one will be a software one, actually near DC, where how many people are not from DC? A few, okay, well, okay. So, he worked for me 22 years ago during my brief 9 months at Amazon. And VJ had a son who was diagnosed with autism. And so Florio has a VR therapeutic approach, and so allows kids with autism to strap on their goggles and experience encountering a police officer on the street or checking out of a grocery store. So those are some of the 4 of the 14 startups I'm currently invested in.
Great. Well, part of the conversation in DC is about, how difficult it is for entrepreneurs to make it from, acqui-hire or startup to IPO. And so a lot of times they get acqui-hired. Can you tell us a little bit about the failed startups that you've encountered? How hard is it to pick winners? And how many, out of all the hundreds of founders you meet, how do you know which ones will make it?
Well, so starting a company is pretty hard. Who's started a company here before? Okay, a few people, yeah, right? A lot of them fail. The stories we tend to hear are the exciting success stories. So we hear about Google, and we hear about Facebook, and we hear about Microsoft, and we hear about Intel. But my first two investments were dramatic failures. The first one was a kind of an ed tech company. I lost more than 120% of my investment because after 4 tranches of investment, when the housing bubble burst, the school district stopped buying. And so we had to lay off staff. And then finally we were faced with Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. Has anyone done that before? Yeah, that's not fun. And so we got sued. 3 of the employees had deferred wages, and we got sued for back wages. And there was no case history in Washington State about how to handle that. So that's how you lose more than 120%. And we'd asked the CEO to clean this up and give them stock options, but that was one of many failings he had. So the second one was somebody who actually used to work for me, and it was smartphone photo sharing, right? Which is a really, really neat idea, but this was 2005, right? The iPhone didn't come out till 2007, so the hardware wasn't really quite ready. I only lost 90% in that one. I started Dreambox Learning to build a new kind of educational software in 2006. I wrote a check for $4 million. I made a lot of mistakes with people I hired. And anyway, I did manage to get all my money back 15 years later, right? So that's better than 90% or 120%. But the startups and angel investing are not for the faint of heart, right? It's pretty hard stuff. And so after those 3 sort of painful first experiences, I took a little hiatus. You might imagine my wife Lisa was not completely happy with the economic results we'd had. And then we changed the protocol. So now I source the deals and do the due diligence, and then Lisa has veto power, right? That works a lot better. Lisa has a computer science undergrad degree, got an MBA, worked at Microsoft on and off for about 8 years. So anyway, so since 2013, we've invested in 16 companies. The first one we got a nice return on. The second one we got an even nicer return on. Both were acquired by larger companies, Okta in one case and Google in the other case. The other 14 are all still going, the oldest since 2014. They've had up rounds and increased revenue. One company that I invested in last year is on probably its last legs, but that's a pretty good record for an angel investor, and, knocking on wood. So.
Just to follow up on that, so when you speak to a founder and you hear about their business idea, how much of it is the person, the founder? How much of it is the particular technology, like deep tech? Earlier, Professor Murray was talking about deep tech, which is really capital intensive and advanced. So some of these technologies that you're looking at are like very advanced tech, biotech, space tech, but then others are consumer. So how do you tell the difference, or how do you sort through so many different deals? And I read through his portfolio. You're in everything: space, biotech, consumer. How do you tell apart these different opportunities?
Well, I should admit I'm a nerd. Is anyone else here a nerd? A few people? Yeah, okay, good. I bought my first book on cryptography in 1969 as a 9-year-old. I can't say I understood the whole thing, but I got a few things out of that. Did anyone read the Mathematical Games column by Martin Gardner in Scientific American? Maybe a few people. So there was a column on the RSA crypto algorithm in 1977. I sent away for the monograph. I still have it. I tried to implement RSA in Fortran with punch cards as a 17-year-old high school student. I didn't understand how carry worked, so that infinite precision integer math escaped me, so I failed at that. We did later implement HTTPS, which uses RSA in IE2 in 1995. So my dad was a musician. As I mentioned, he was a drummer. He was also a hobbyist. Anyone built a Heathkit back there? Is anyone old enough to have built a Heathkit? A few people. Good. He built the Heathkit color TV kit, which was the most complex kit at the time in the late 60s. You actually had to build the oscilloscope kit first so you could debug the color TV, so that was kind of fun. He built an electronic synthesizer of his own design in the early 70s, and so he was subscribed to Electronics Magazine. He got me subscriptions to Byte Magazine, to anyone, Byte Magazine, Kilobaud. So, I was marinating in these kind of things. So, and so when you're trying to evaluate an idea for a business and evaluate founders, the stories we hear again are these big success stories. the Facebook guys got together and wham, and it blew off, and Twitter and all that stuff. But most companies don't grow that quickly. So Microsoft, when I joined, was a 10-year-old company. Bill Gates and Paul Allen had started in 1975. It now did have $120 million of revenue for an 800-person company in 1985. That's pretty good, right? Software has nice margins. And so when I'm talking to someone about a startup, I want to know, like, what's the real problem you're going to solve that real people are going to pay you for and that you're going to do a better job of than the existing competition? I mean, that's the basic question, right? And so I ask all my nerdy questions. And so when I met Andy Lapsa, who's the co-founder and CEO of Stoke Space, I had built 50 model rockets of my own design back in the 1970s. Normal kids were doing, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and sports. In middle school and high school, I was building model rockets and reading Scientific American and doing other things. So, and so I spent 20 to 30 hours a week building model rockets in the 70s. I wasn't building propulsion systems. I was using the Estes rockets. Anyway, so when I met Andy, and I got to visit their test site, and they did a little test, and I asked all my nerdy questions, and he had great answers for all those kinds of things. And so I'm like, yes, we're going to do this. Now, am I confident they'll reduce cost of space launch for satellites by 20x? I don't really know. I asked him questions like how much was it going to cost for first launch. I mean, he had answers to everything. So I just, one of the reasons I mentioned how many people I interviewed and hired at Microsoft was that after a while you get to be good at pattern matching.
Great. And so that's your startup portfolio. How about your experiences at large tech companies early on? So you worked at IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon. Could you tell us a little bit about those early days in those larger tech companies? I mean, that's like 2 generations ago, I would say, when you were there, or
well,
one?
We used to talk about, dog years or something at Microsoft. So I'm a bit of a student of history when it comes to technology and companies. I've read a ton of books on these things. And I'm always kind of fascinated, like, well, how does that all work? And some people probably read the Clayton Christensen book, The Innovator's Dilemma. A few people maybe read that. Has anyone read Jim Utterback's book, Mastering the Dynamics of Innovation? Yeah, he didn't have a good PR agent. This book I found in the fall of 1994 as I was starting the Internet Explorer team. And before Amazon, so that was like a little hard. It was amazing. And he and his graduate students had looked at 20 industries as they went through change, and who were the market leaders before, and who were the market leaders after. What was the industry or the business that the richest family in Boston owned in the late 1800s? Does anyone know? No hands. Yes, yeah, so that's right. You don't know because it was the harvested ice industry. Who even knew there was a harvested ice industry? They would go out to little ponds with their little sleds and tools and cut up the ice and put it in insulated sleds and take it back to insulated sheds and put it on ships and sail around the world, right? Of course, what happened? Electrification and then refrigerators. So people used to have ice boxes, so there was mechanical production of ice, and you get the ice deliveries, and eventually we had refrigerators in our homes, right? He looked at a bunch of different things. So one of the myths around big companies is that they last forever, right? When I joined IBM in June of 1982, it was 364,000 employees. Wow. I looked that up later. I didn't know at the time. And in my experience as a 22-year-old straight out of undergrad, not knowing anything about corporate culture and stuff, was this is Poughkeepsie, New York. There were 2 or 3 smart people out of 100 in my experience. The managers were all CYA. If you don't know what that word means, you can look it up later. Nothing was really happening. I mean, the security guards would sweep the building at 7 p.m. and kick you out. You weren't allowed to work on weekends. And those big 3270 terminals are very heavy, and a 300 baud modem, you couldn't work remotely, right? The great thing about that year at IBM was I realized that the mainframe was dead. And that prediction proved to be true. And I also decided that mini computers would be dead next. And so I sent snail mail to Apple and Microsoft and ended up at Microsoft June of '85. So Microsoft's a very dynamic place at a 10-year-old company. We had not shipped Windows yet, right? The hot machine was an IBM PC AT which had a 80286 chip, 16-bit chip, a couple megabytes of RAM if you could afford it, a 20 megabyte hard drive, wow, that is rocking, and a color EGA display. And anyway, so one of the things I was going to comment about, we were talking about regulation here, is I'm a victim of, or I've been subjected to regulation in many, many different ways. I was actually deposed for 8 different legal matters related to my time at Microsoft, so we'll talk about that a little bit. But one of the funny things I had to do, did anyone hear of OS2? You know, that was a joint operating system project with IBM and Microsoft. So there were export controls back then. And so apparently an IBM AT running MS-DOS could be exported to Russia, or Soviet Union. But there was a concern that OS2 would somehow enable an IBM PCAT to develop and design atomic bombs. And so there was some formula that some staffer for some senator had probably worked out, where you had to multiply amount of memory and MIPS and storage and other things, and if that number was too big, you weren't allowed to sell it to the Soviet Union. So that was one of my first experiences with regulation. So then Microsoft, we shipped Windows. It wasn't until Windows 3.0 in 1990 that Windows was kind of good enough for people to use. Windows 95 was a big deal because it was 32-bit. We had the internet. So what happened to Microsoft in the 20th century, though? Right? It was kind of, right? What happened to mobile? Where was Microsoft with mobile? Where was Microsoft with search, right? Microsoft missed the boat on a few things. So that's a very common story, that a company becomes very successful and then it stops innovating, right? That's a really a challenge. Now, when I went to Amazon, I left Microsoft, and I was an early customer at Amazon, customer 10,272. I looked that up later. And I bought 4 mystery books for my wife, December 9th, 1995. Yeah, okay. And so in my 9 months at Amazon, I had half the software engineers at Amazon working for me. Everyone who was not doing the website was on my team. So I had supply chain, distribution center software, customer service software, and all the packaged finance, HR, legal, time clock stuff. 167 people, exciting job. But Jeff Bezos and I, creative differences, that's what they say in Hollywood. So after, he was Times Man of the Year, I was just the new guy. So by June of 2000, I'm like, dude, you can have your company. My kids were 8, 6, and 4, so that was fun. But Amazon is a software-first company, right? And you can see how it's grown dramatically. And so when I hear all this regulatory talk, oh my God, these big companies, we have to punish them and restrict them and stuff like that, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies. And partly because just be patient, right? I mean, these big companies often get too big, and then they turn inward and they lose their way, right? So if you're just patient, eventually some new upstart will come around. I mean, so think about it. I left IBM in June of 1983, 364,000 employees, the computer company, billions of dollars in the bank, patents, all that stuff. And I went to tiny little 10-year-old Microsoft with 800 people. And I'd get on an airplane sometimes, in 85 or 86, and no one ever heard of Microsoft at that point, right? And Microsoft obviously went, boom, right? Okay, and then they had their quiescent period for 12 years. And now they're back, right? Kind of, they have their cloud stuff, that's good. But how many people have a Windows laptop? How many people have Macintosh laptops? More, okay. So how many people have an iPhone? How many people have an Android phone? Not so many. Okay. All right. So things shift around. So Apple lost out in the PC era because they were vertically integrated, and Microsoft won because they weren't. And now, of course, in the smartphone era, Apple is winning. In terms of prices they can charge. They just don't have the same market share, obviously, as Android. All right. I feel like I talked too long.
Great. Well, that leads us into the questions Q&A. So I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2. Yeah. Okay.
So I'll just say it. So I sort of have the premise that culture persists regardless of CEO. So my question is, in your big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, do you agree with that? Or do you think culture actually can change as the CEO changes? And second part of culture, is culture different now that younger people are leading companies? Do you see a big difference in this new generation of leaders compared to where you started in the world with that generation of leaders who were sort of lucky because they got to the internet when it was brand new and distributed computing? So those people were like lucky in some way.
Okay, I'm going to restate your question. All right. Your question is, does culture matter? I'm going to repeat your question. So does culture, for the studio audience, yeah. Okay, so your question is, does culture matter in a company? Does culture change over time within a company? And have I seen generational shifts in the kinds of cultures at, for example, the startups? Okay, so for sure, Microsoft beat IBM with its culture. And for sure, the companies that Microsoft was losing out to in the 20th century beat Microsoft with their cultures, right? And at Microsoft, the culture did change. And the change was a change that happens in any large organization. As companies get larger, the politicians, if I could use that word, who are good at sort of managing up and all that kind of stuff, they tend to come into positions of power. And so when I look at the startups, I see many different kinds of leaders and creating many different kinds of cultures. And so the important thing is if you have a clear vision of what you're trying to achieve, and then you're trying to hire the kind of people that buy into that vision, that's super important. And then you have to think about what are the talents and skills you need to do that. But I can't say, the prototypical culture, for a startup led by a 26-year-old is different from a 50-year-old.
Great. And I'll ask one question from the Slido. Which, if any, current big companies do you think will face existential crisis in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, so the amazing thing is IBM's still here, right? And I left, a long time ago. So these companies can last a long time. On the other hand, Kodak invented the digital camera, but couldn't switch their horses. And I mean, RIM. I loved my BlackBerry. Probably a lot of people loved their BlackBerries in the early part of the 20th century, but they lost their way. So big companies that are. I think Google, ignoring any challenges from Congress or the regulators, I think Google faces a lot of uncertainty in terms of what it's supposed to be when it grows up. I think Facebook has a similar problem. I apologize for the Facebook people in the audience. I think a lot of young people are sort of burnt out on that kind of stuff. Amazon is going to face a lot of headwinds. The labor unions, I think there's going to be some challenges. But AWS is a pretty powerful thing. So I think Amazon's got a lot of headway ahead. So as Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, especially about the future.
And on that note, I think that was a great fireside chat.
Thank
you, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
One second.
All right, content moderation, people.